Hello, we welcome you to our study today, Ruth chapter 3. If you will, please turn in your Bibles to Ruth 3 and verse 1. So far in our study, we have noted how that Naomi returns to Bethlehem with the woman from Moab. Ruth was the Moabitess. Both she and Naomi had lost their husbands. They were both widows. In chapter 2, we see how that Ruth went to work in the field. And while in the field, she met Boaz. And after the day of gleaning in the field, she returned to Naomi and told her how she had met Boaz. Chapter 3 leads us to Ruth approaching Boaz for marriage. So if you will, please look at verses 1 through 5. Verse 1, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Naomi wanted to help Ruth find a husband. "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you?" To seek security is literally to seek rest. One version reads, find a home. Not just a house, a place to live. To seek rest or to find security in this sense is the idea of security of a husband in marriage. And so the kind of security in Naomi's mind is the rest in the home of her husband in marriage. Naomi will do what she can and reveals a plan to help her daughter-in-law, Ruth. Earlier, Naomi prayed for her two daughters-in-law. The Lord grant that you may find rest each in the house of her husband. Ruth chapter 1 and verse 9. And so in the first chapter, she prayed for both daughters-in-law. One returned to Moab, the other returned with her to Bethlehem in Judah. Ruth in Judah works the field, meets Boaz, and we see the kindness of both for each other. Here, Naomi is making a plan, and she presents the plan to her daughter-in-law, Ruth. She would be well provided for in marriage to Boaz. So these are some of the thoughts that were running through her mind. Verse 2, now Boaz, whose young women you are with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Verse 2, Naomi encourages Ruth, is he not our relative? In this passage, she knew Ruth. She knew Boaz. Boaz was a close relative of Naomi's husband. We see this in Ruth 2, verse 1, and also verse 20. She told Ruth that Boaz was winnowing barley that night on the threshing floor. Winnowing is the removal of the chaff by tossing the barley up into the air. In this case, on the threshing floor, the place for threshing out the grain. The work of winnowing ended, in this case, with a feast. The plan was for Ruth to reveal herself to Boaz after he finished eating and drinking. And so she would wait to present herself to Boaz. Verse 3, the plan continues. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So Naomi's plan for Ruth to prepare to meet Boaz. Ruth would wash. She would put on perfume. She would put on her best clothes. She would go to the threshing floor, but she would wait to present herself to him until after he had finished eating and drinking. Verse 4, then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. The plan for Ruth is that when Boaz lies down, she will observe the place where he lies. Then go in, uncover his feet, and lie down. And that, after Boaz will indicate what you should do. So she didn't have all the answers, but she presented her plan to Ruth in this fashion. To uncover his feet is to remove the covering from over his feet where he laid. What does this mean? It appears to be an act symbolizing her proposal to marriage. The plan may seem objectionable to some from a moral standpoint. However, we ought to see in the context, it was not objectionable when judged by the customs of the people of Israel at the time. Consider that according to Boaz, he and the town held Ruth to be, quote, a virtuous woman. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11. And so whatever it meant, this was not the actions of an immoral woman. Boaz held her to be a virtuous woman, chapter 3 and verse 11. So it appears here that this is a custom, as a symbol for a marriage proposal. Verse 5, and she said to her, all that you say to me, I will do. And so Ruth trusted the advice of Naomi. She would do as Naomi had planned. In verses 6 to 13, we see how Ruth approaches Boaz. Verse 6, so she went down to the threshing floor and did to all that her mother-in-law instructed her. So Ruth did as Naomi told her to do. She washed, she anointed herself, that is, perhaps she put on perfume and her best clothes, her best garments, and then she went down to the threshing floor, just like we saw in verse 3. Verse 7, and after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Verse 7, after Boaz finished eating and drinking, it says his heart was cheerful. Other versions read, his heart was merry. He was in good spirits. After this, it says how he lied down at the end of a heap of grain. So he had spent the day on the threshing floor. And now, at the end of the day, they had a feast, and now he's lying down to rest. Ruth, as instructed by her mother-in-law Naomi, noticed the place where he lay down and came to him softly. She approached quietly. And so, as instructed, she uncovered his feet and lay down. Now, that's as far as the instructions were, as far as Naomi instructing Ruth on what to do. Wait for further information from Boaz, was basically what she said earlier. Verse 8, now it happened at midnight that the man was startled and turned himself, and there was a woman. There a woman was laying at his feet. And so you could imagine he was startled. It's midnight. He turned, he realized that there was a woman laying at his feet. It was dark, and so he didn't recognize the person, but he did recognize that it was a woman. Verse 9, and he said, who are you? So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. Boaz asked the woman who she was. It was a good question. It being the middle of the night and dark, he did not recognize her. He only knew that she was a woman. Ruth identified herself to him as Ruth, his maidservant. We see this back in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 13. Take your maidservant under your wing. Now, we recognize this is a figure of speech. She is speaking metaphorically to Boaz. Take your maidservant under your wing. Boaz does not literally have a wing, and so this is a symbol. What does it represent? Kaufman, in his commentary, said this was a proposal of marriage. We know from the passage that Boaz was a close relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. Ruth pointed out to Boaz that as a close relative, he could serve as the family redeemer. He could ultimately redeem her in marriage. Let's look more closely at this idea of a symbol of wings. To be under the wings of God was to find security. Back in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 12, we see the symbol used. Naomi wanted Ruth to find security or rest in marriage. Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. Some other versions read, "Spread your wings over your servant," or "Spread your covering over your maid," or "Spread the corner of your garment over me." And so, take your maidservant under your wing. Ruth followed Naomi's plan in that she uncovered his feet, lied down, and as Naomi said, he will tell you what you should do. However, I think we see that Ruth was a little more assertive. Verse 10, "Then he said, 'Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich.'" From this passage, I think we can see that this is a proposal to marriage. We can see that from what Boaz responds in verse 10. Boaz blesses Ruth. The passage suggests that the young woman Ruth had other options as far as a husband was concerned. She could have married a young man, whether rich or poor. She had showed kindness to Naomi, yet now she showed even more kindness in that she was willing to marry Boaz for the benefit of the family, for the family of Naomi, as a redeeming relative. That's why they emphasize it was a close relative, that Boaz was a, quote, close relative of theirs, of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. And so here we see them pointing this out. Boaz might have been an older man at this time, and so that emphasizes even more her unselfishness. Ruth showed kindness to Naomi. Earlier, Naomi said to Ruth, "The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me," Ruth 1 and verse 8. Boaz had heard how this kind woman, Ruth, how kind she was to Naomi, how Ruth left her father and her mother, her country and her God to follow Naomi to a foreign land to live with her. And she also worked in the field to provide for her and for herself. And so this close relative would serve as a redeeming relative according to the law of Moses. Verse 11, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request. For all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." Note, and perhaps you've seen this earlier, that Boaz calls Ruth my daughter. She's not literally his daughter, but a young woman. Boaz called Ruth a virtuous woman. She had a reputation in Bethlehem of being a virtuous woman. She, according to other translations, was a woman of excellence, a worthy woman, a woman of noble character. So Boaz says to Ruth, "I will do for you all that you request." What had she requested? Well, she had requested marriage. In an act of selflessness, she would choose to marry Boaz so that he could serve as the redeemer for the family. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 9, as a close relative of Elimelech, of Naomi's husband. Verse 12, "Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I." So there is one obstacle. Boaz points this out, that while he was a close relative, there was a relative that was even closer, who was even closer than he, who would be first by rights to perform the duty of a redeemer, to serve as the redeeming relative. The text does not describe the exact relationship between Boaz and Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Boaz said, I am a close relative. Some have suggested that Elimelech was his cousin. Boaz also said, there is a relative closer than I. Some have suggested that perhaps there was an uncle, that he was an uncle to Elimelech. As I mentioned, our text reads a close relative. Other versions read a redeemer or a guardian redeemer of our family, so the family redeemer. The benefits derived from functioning as this redeeming family member required a series of priorities. Closer relatives were given the opportunity to exercise the function first as a redeeming relative. And so the redeemer's role was to help recover the family's losses, whether it was loss of life or loss of property, whatever it may have been. Verse 13, he says, stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, that is, as redeeming relative, to redeem the family, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. And so the closer relative was in line to perform the duty of the Redeemer. If he was willing to perform the duty of a close relative as a Redeemer for Ruth, then he had the right to do it. He could serve as Redeemer. He could marry her too. Boaz swore to take Ruth as his wife if the closer relative would refuse. He would see him in the morning. He invited Ruth to stay the night, to lie down until morning. Verses 14 to 18. Ruth speaks with Naomi. And so she tells her what happened. Verse 14, so she lay at his feet until morning, and she arose before one could recognize another. Then he said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And so we see how Ruth stayed until morning. She arose early while it was still dark, before she could be recognized. Boaz said, do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Why did he say this? Why did he say what we see here in verse 14? Do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. What did he mean? Who was he talking to? The reason might have been to preserve her honor as a virtuous woman. While nothing immoral had been done, the presence of the woman on the threshing floor might have been misunderstood. Again, to whom was Boaz speaking? Well, it's possible that he may have been speaking to a servant. He may have also been speaking to himself. Perhaps he was even praying to God. And so do not let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Perhaps he was praying, or he was talking to himself, or he was talking to a servant. But whoever he was talking to, he was concerned for her. I don't believe that he was concerned for his own reputation. Again, nothing had been done immoral by himself or by her, but to prevent the possibility of a misunderstanding with someone else in Bethlehem, then don't let anybody know. Do not let it be known. Verse 15. Also he said, bring the shawl that is on you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 ephahs of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. Verse 15, Boaz instructed Ruth to bring her shawl. The shawl is a garment or a covering for the head or for the shoulders. Some other versions read cloak and garment. And so as she held the shawl, he poured out 6 ephahs of barley into the shawl, and he laid it on her. And she went into the city. How much barley grain did Boaz measure out for Ruth? And so this question comes up. Note that ephahs in the New King James Version is in italics. Italics indicate that it was added by the translators. We only know that he measured 6 of barley, 6 unknown units of barley. And so we might say that he measured 6 of barley, whatever 6 something was. And so exactly how much he measured for her is not indicated. In other passages, such as Ruth 2 and 17, the Hebrew term translated ephah can mean an actual ephah or simply a general measure for grain, measure in general. So while it may be the measure of an ephah, which is 10 omers according to Exodus 16:36, it can refer to a measure in general. Other versions read simply 6 measures of barley. So whatever those measures were. And so ephah perhaps is a general measurement, 6 measures of barley. What about if ephahs is actual 6 ephahs of grain? Well, Ruth would have been very strong. An ephah is calculated to be about 2/3 of a bushel of grain. Again, some have calculated this to be between 180 to 300 pounds. So the measurement itself is not exact to begin with. But if she was carrying an actual 6 ephahs of grain, it would have been a great deal of grain. Earlier, after gathering all day, Ruth had gleaned about an ephah of barley and carried it back to town. Another question you might have, how far is it to town? How far is it to Bethlehem? From the field, from the threshing floor, where Boaz had placed the grain, poured it into her shaw. Well, the passage does not say, and we don't know. So that's left to our curiosity. Verse 16, when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "Is that you, my daughter?" So Ruth came to Naomi, and she said, "Is that you, my daughter?" Didn't she know who she was? Well, perhaps it was still too dark. We read earlier how that it was dark when she had left. Ruth did arise early in the morning, according to chapter 3, verse 14, before one could recognize another. And so it appears that it was just too dark for her to recognize her. Naomi suspected that it was her daughter-in-law, Ruth, but was not certain. Now, some other versions read this way: "How did it go, my daughter?" Or, "How did you fare, my daughter?" And so Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for Ruth that day. And so it may be that when she says, "Is that you, my daughter?" she simply recognizes her as a young woman, daughter in that sense. But if she is using the word daughter here in the sense that she recognized her in some fashion, wasn't certain, perhaps it was just too dark. I think that's what it is. It was just too dark, and she thought it was her, and so she asked her this question. Verse 17, and she said, "These 6 ephahs of barley he gave me, for he said to you, do not go empty-handed to your mother-in-law." So here in verse 17, Ruth tells Naomi that the reason for the 6 measures of barley that he poured into her shawl was that he did not want her to go home empty-handed. And so it appears that he gave her these 6 measures of barley into her shawl, and she carried them into town. Did she carry these on her head? That's possible. Could have carried it on her back. But we see that she apparently had something in her hands. Perhaps she held it on her head with her hands. Again, left to her curiosity. Verse 17, verse 18, then she said, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." So Ruth told Naomi how well it went with Boaz that day. It appears to me that she was excited. See chapter 3, verse 16. So She must have been excited. She had to have been. Naomi says to Ruth, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out. For the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." So she is calling for Ruth to be patient, and to be patient was wise advice. Of course, that's wise advice anytime. Naomi, knowing Boaz, was confident that he would not rest till the matter was settled. So you can imagine her anxiously, perhaps, or eagerly waiting for the news. What's going to happen? What will Boaz find out? Well, all that is revealed to us in the final chapter of the book. So we invite you to come back next time. Ruth chapter 4 will be our study then. Lord willing, we'll continue and we'll finish up the book. We invite you to continue to study this book and other books of the Bible on your own. There's much more that we could learn, but for the time that we have today, we hope that this has been helpful in your understanding of this text. Until next time, we invite you to return, and God bless.